I'm really excited now to introduce Siim Land. He's an anthropologist and an 8 times best-selling author from Estonia. And he has recently written his 9th book, The Longevity Leap. On the stage, he will share the major risk to your health and practical steps to extend your lifespan. So please help me give Siim a huge hand and welcome him here on the stage.
Hello. This is my first time in Copenhagen. It's a very beautiful city, and this is also my first time doing a speech with these kind of headphones, which might be a different kind of an experience, but yeah, I think you'll still learn quite a lot of valuable information from my presentation. And the topic of my speech is longevity intelligence, which is a term that I've coined. We've all heard of emotional intelligence, financial intelligence, like there's all different kinds of intelligences out there. And I think it's also important to have something that would describe your understanding of your health and your risk factors for longevity. So this is what I'm going to be talking about in my speech. And we've all heard the saying that life equals time. You know, it kind of means that the amount of time you're alive is literally is the representation of your lifespan, how much time you are alive in years and decades. And many people say that time is equal to money and therefore life is equal to money, which can be true to a certain extent. You know, if you have more financial, like disposable income, etc., then you can take care of your health in a better way. You can spend more money on different kind of tests and doctors, etc. But just money itself isn't enough, in my opinion, because you can have all the money in the world, but if you don't know how to use it, or even if you don't apply the practical information that you need to do, then the money is useless. So that's why, in my opinion, it's better to say that life equals to time and time equals longevity intelligence. So what is longevity intelligence? There are multiple factors or contributing components here. The main ones, in my opinion, are your lifestyle and disease risks. So these are things like heart disease, Alzheimer's, cancer risks, etc. Genetic risks. So the genes that you have, they are also predisposing you to certain chronic diseases, as well as longevity. You have bad genes, you have good genes, and there's, you know, thousands of them, too many to count. The next component is your biomarkers, so the actual blood work, your fitness status, your blood pressure, waist circumference, all those things also affect your health and they affect your risk factors for these chronic diseases, or they are the risk factors themselves. Next up, you have biological age. We all have our chronological age, which is the age in our passport. But each and every one of us also has our biological age, which refers to the age of our body, or like the health status of our body. And every one of us has a different trajectory with our biological age. You know, our chronological age proceeds every year by 1 year, but our biological age can be different. It can be faster than our chronological age, or it can be also slower. And for longevity, obviously, we want to have a slightly lower biological age and a slower speed of aging. So these things are controllable, as shown by many clinical trials and other studies. And the last component is what I call the longevity horizon. And this describes what happens to your health over the course of decades. So there is age-related changes that occur in our body. We're never going to be as youthful as we were in our teenage years. So there is going to be some changes that happen naturally, these age-related processes, but just by understanding them, we can also slow down the decline much better, and in so doing, extend our health span and our lifespan as well. So in the remaining of my presentation, I'm going to go through each of these components, and I'm going to give some examples of practical takeaways as well for you to implement. A little bit about my backstory. So why did I get into longevity? So one of the main reasons was my grandfather, who died to colorectal cancer when he was 36. So I'm 30 right now. He died when he was 36. So, you know, it's not much older than I am currently. And he's an example of someone who had lower level of longevity intelligence. Not because it was his fault, he was born in a circumstance where most people didn't have any idea of what is healthy. Like, he was born in the formerly Soviet-occupied Estonia. He died in the 80s. So he never did like any blood test. He never did a DNA test. He never knew what his risk factors were. And he never also did a colonoscopy, which is the best way to detect colorectal cancer. And colorectal cancer is also one of those types of cancers that if you detect it early enough, you can pretty much eliminate it completely and you can survive. But he obviously never did a colonoscopy because, first of all, he lived in the Soviet Union, so no one did those kind of things. And second of all, he was very young. So usually they'll start recommending men to do colonoscopies in their 50s. So he was much younger than what would have been standard procedure for his age. And also he did have some unhealthy lifestyle. He smoked, he drank alcohol. So he wasn't like a particularly biohacker or like a health enthusiast in that sense. So this ultimately was one of the main reasons why he died so early as well. And, I'm also very young. I'm 30 years old at the moment. And this might raise the question, okay, why do you speak about longevity? I shared my personal reasons why I do it, but I also have some proof to show that I think I know what I'm talking about. So recently, a few months ago, I was number 1 at the Rejuvenation Olympics, which is this leaderboard dashboard that was created by Brian Johnson that measures the speed of aging with this DNA methylation test. And I had the lowest score at that time. Now, I haven't done the test again over a year, but I do know what I'm talking about from my own personal experience and research. And I've also done organ age tests that measure the biological age of your organs. So at the time of the test, I was 29 years old. And my average organ age was 17. So even my liver was 9 years old based on this test, and my brain was 13 years old, which I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. And lastly, I'll say that it's not also very wise to take longevity advice from the centenarians, the longest living people, because they don't have any particularly healthy habits. They have the same habits as everyone else. They smoke, they drink alcohol, they eat ice cream. So if the average person would start following their advice, then they would die much sooner. So the reason why the centenarians live so long is because of their genetics. They could follow whatever lifestyle, they will still live very long. So that's why it's for us mere mortals to use science and research to figure out what is the healthy thing to do and what kind of diet to follow, etc. So I'm going to start with the main component of longevity intelligence, which is your lifestyle and disease risk factors. What are the main chronic diseases in the world, the main causes of death in the developed world or worldwide even? They are, number 1, ischemic heart disease, 2, stroke, 3, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, 4, lower respiratory infections, 5, neonatal conditions, 6, trachea, bronchus, and lung cancers, 7, Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, 8, diarrheal diseases, 9, diabetes, and 10, kidney disease. So most people will die to one of these 10 conditions. And heart disease is by far the number 1 killer in the world. So about 30% of people will die to some form of heart disease. So if you want to live long, then reducing the risk of these chronic diseases and postponing them, delaying them, is one of the most important steps to focus on. And they've actually done some studies on the centenarians as well, looking at their trajectory of health. And they find that the centenarians, the people who live over the age of 100, they typically fall into one of these 3 categories. Number 1 is the survivors. These people get diagnosed with a particular chronic disease, like heart disease or cancer, before the age of 80, and they still make it to the age of 100. So they survive the disease. The second group are the delayers. They delay the disease until 80, and then they reach the age of 100. And the last group are the escapers. These people avoid all of these chronic diseases altogether until the age of 100. So most of the centenarians, up to 80%, are either delayers or escapers. So they completely avoid these chronic diseases until the age of 100, or did they delay them until the age of 80? So they get these diseases much later in life than the average person does. And this is also the reason why they live so long. And the last smaller group of centenarians are the survivors. So these people get this chronic disease before the age of 80, but they still make it to 100. So it goes to show that to live longer, then you want to either delay or escape the main chronic diseases, get them as late as possible, and hopefully avoid them altogether. But it also means that there's hope for survivors. So even though you might get a particular chronic disease before the age of 80, you still have a pretty good chance to make it to 100 if you follow the right lifestyle after the fact. A good example of this is the longest living man in history, Jérôme Kimura from Japan. He lived until the age of 116, and he was free from pretty much all chronic diseases until the age of 111, when he was diagnosed with kidney disease. And then at the last year of his life, 8 months before his death, he had 3 subsecutive heart failures. So he's a great example of a escaper. He avoided all the chronic diseases even into his supercentenarian years. And this is also what we would ideally want to emulate, to get the diseases as late as possible. So to illustrate it, you can see that the average person might start getting heart disease, cancer, diabetes, kidney disease a few decades earlier than the centenarians. Like the average person might start to gain some comorbidities like hypertension and diabetes somewhere in their 50s and 60s, which is also the reason why their lifespan is slightly shorter than the centenarians' lifespan. The centenarians get the same diseases, they just get them 2 decades later. And the reason they do that is because of genetics. Like they don't take supplements usually, they don't exercise, they drink wine, they smoke, etc. They do all the wrong things, but they still live to the age of 100. And it doesn't take a lot of effort to add 24 years to your life expectancy. In research, they've found that there's only 8 habits that you need to follow to gain 24 years to your life expectancy, and they are being physically active, being free from opioid addiction, not smoking, stress management, good diet, not binge drinking regularly, so the key word is regularly here, and good sleep hygiene, and lastly, good social relationships. So it obviously isn't very difficult, and it covers a whole wide spectrum of activities. So it's not just that you only exercise or that you only eat a good diet, you need to do all of them. So you need to be more balanced. Rather than focusing only on one thing, like longevity is more about covering a good baseline with all of these beneficial things that are good for our health, including social relationships, including sleep and stress management, etc. These chronic diseases also follow a certain timeline of events. They don't happen at the same time, they happen at different ages. The average age of a heart attack is 64, and this is also the time where the rates of heart disease are the highest compared to other chronic diseases. Cancer also follows a similar trend line, so it starts to rise somewhere in the 60s and 70s. But Alzheimer's happens slightly later than heart disease and cancer. So the average age of a Alzheimer's diagnosis is late 70s and early 80s. So your chronological age, getting older, is the biggest risk factor for all of the chronic diseases. The older you are, the higher your risk of Alzheimer's, cancer, and heart disease, no matter your health status. So it doesn't matter how healthy you are. If you're 100 years old, then you have a higher risk of these chronic diseases because of aging, because of being older biologically. And this is also important point to maintain a lower biological age. So if you have a lower biological age, you reduce all of the risk, or reduce the risk of all of the chronic diseases in so doing as well. And our goal is to die to natural causes or die to aging itself. We want to avoid cancer and Alzheimer's and cancer or heart disease as long as possible, and then die to aging itself when we're over 100 years old. So let's start with heart disease, the #1 killer in the world. The American Heart Association has outlined life's essential 8 components for reducing the risk of heart disease, because prevention is the most effective tool in our toolbox. And these 8 components are: quit tobacco, be more active, eat healthy, manage blood pressure, manage blood sugar, control cholesterol, manage weight, and get healthy sleep. So again, they're not very difficult or complex topics. It's mostly about adherence and being consistent with these things like exercise and good diet. And they also acknowledge that biological age is the biggest risk factor for heart disease. So combining that understanding with the hallmarks of aging, which I'm not going to go into depth right now, but essentially slowing down your speed of biological aging also reduces the risk of heart disease and all the other chronic diseases. So what are the biggest risk factors for heart disease? This large study on over 1.3 million people pretty much found that there are 5 biggest risk factors. The biggest one is diabetes. So as you can see from the graph, the higher it is, the number or the lines, the higher the risk. So being diagnosed with diabetes across all age groups is linked to a higher risk of heart disease. And it's higher the younger you are. So if you have diabetes at a younger age, then that's linked to an even higher risk of heart disease compared to having diabetes when you're 80 years old. The second biggest risk factor is smoking or being a current smoker. And again, across all ages, it increases the risk. Third is increased cholesterol, non-HDL cholesterol. So that's per 38.67 milligrams per deciliter increase, which is 1 millimole increase. So every millimole increase in cholesterol increases the risk of heart disease as well. So it's a cumulative effect. Having just 1 millimole elevation in non-HDL cholesterol, as you can see from the graph, isn't a very big increase in risk. But if you have 3 or 4 or 5 millimole increase, then that's almost the equivalent of diabetes. So the higher the cholesterol over a longer period of time, the higher the risk will end up being over the course of decades. And the same with blood pressure. Per 20 unit increase in systolic blood pressure also increases the risk. And the higher the blood pressure, the higher the risk. And lastly, the same with BMI. Every 5 unit increase in BMI also increases the risk, not as much as blood pressure or cholesterol or smoking. But again, it's a cumulative effect. If you have 15 unit increase in BMI, then that's a much higher risk as well. Alzheimer's disease and other dementias are similar to heart disease because some of the risk factors that increase heart disease risk also increase the risk of Alzheimer's and neurodegeneration. So what's good for the heart is also good for the brain. So the same risk factors, avoid diabetes, avoid smoking, exercise regularly, maintain normal blood work, etc. With dementias and Alzheimer's, there's also additional risk factors. So on this graph at the top right corner, you can see what are the things that increase the risk the most. There are things like cerebral microbleeds, sleep disturbance, depression, diabetes, hyperhomocystinemia, so high homocysteine levels, atrial fibrillation, obesity, stress, stroke, smoking, head traumas, frailty, etc. And on the bottom right corner, you have things that are protective against neurodegeneration, and they're like vitamin C, weight loss, physical exercise, healthy dietary pattern, and cognitive activity. So using your brain, using your cognition is protective against Alzheimer's. And on the bottom left corner, you can see that education, especially early in life, and maintaining educational activity and learning throughout your life is also protective against Alzheimer's. So it's a concept called cognitive reserve. You increase your brain's capacity to withstand neurodegeneration just by virtue of using your brain and using your cognition. All right, let's shift to longevity horizon. So this is the concept of, okay, what happens to your health over the course of time, over the course of decades. So, an average person who might not be very health conscious, they follow a regular lifestyle, they don't exercise, etc. Their health trajectory or health span, it can be much shorter than a healthy person's health span. So how long you stay healthy. And this, obviously varies a lot between people. If you smoke, you drink a lot of alcohol, you're obese, you don't exercise, you don't sleep, then your health span is much shorter. You're going to deteriorate much faster. Whereas if you maintain a good diet, good body weight, you exercise regularly, you get proper amounts of sleep, you cover your micronutrient requirements, then you stay healthier for longer. And it's also reasonable to think that by increasing your health span, you also increase your lifespan, because healthy people typically live longer. And vice versa, unhealthy people typically live shorter. But it also describes just the independence in your everyday life. If you are physically active, you're also able to take care of yourself physically for longer. You can carry your groceries, you can lift things up in your house, you can put on your clothes yourself. Whereas if you have a short health span, you have physical limitations, then you're not going to be able to take care of yourself that well, which is I think no one really wants that. So muscle strength is one of those things that follows this trend line. It peaks usually in your 30s, early 30s, and then starts to decline. Now the speed of how fast it declines depends a lot on your health and whether or not you exercise, especially whether or not you do muscle strengthening activities. So the decline is inevitable. Even if you're a power lifter, your strength is going to be lower in your 80s compared to your 40s or 50s. It's just that how fast it declines and how low it's going to drop, that can be controlled. So by maintaining physical activity and doing exercise, you stay stronger for longer, which is also an independent risk factor for all-cause mortality. So being weaker is linked to a higher risk of death from all causes, because strength is a sign of health and youth as well. And I think a lot of people might have seen this picture that illustrates the difference between a sedentary 74-year-old man and a sedentary-year-old triathlete who is exercising a lot. And as you can see, the sedentary person's quadriceps muscles, they look like Wagyu beef. So this fat begins to accumulate. It accumulates in between the muscle tissue, where it promotes inflammation and reduces nutrient signaling, promotes diabetes risk, etc. Whereas the triathlete, it's like a lean sirloin steak, which is what is a healthier muscle composition. The fat accumulation inside the muscle is particularly worrisome for metabolic health, and it also is a sign of aging, that because the visceral fat that accumulates in between the organs and inside the muscles, that is a natural process of aging as well. But if you maintain physical activity and exercise, as you can see in the example of the 70-year-old triathlete, then you can maintain a very similar muscle composition as someone who is decades younger. Hand grip strength is a very simple and easy way to assess your total body strength, but it's also considered to be a biomarker for overall health and longevity. So the low hand grip strength has been seen to be correlating with things like heart disease, hypertension, etc. And higher grip strength is also linked to lower risk of death from all causes. So it's not obviously that, okay, if you have good strength, that it's somehow directly reducing your risk of heart disease. It's just that to have high grip strength, then you need to be exercising and you need to be healthy overall and you need to be strong overall. So doing things that increase your grip strength, like resistance exercise, is also good for longevity, and it reduces risk of all of these chronic diseases, and it's linked to greater health span and greater lifespan. Whereas the opposite is also the case, that a low grip strength, if your grip is weak, then that's a sign, or that's also correlated with a higher risk of heart disease and all-cause mortality. This is a good example of a 98-year-old gymnast. She's the oldest gymnast in the world, Johanna Quaz. I don't think I can play the video, but this is I made a post on my Instagram that went pretty viral. It got 43 million views, and it's just a 98-year-old. I think she was 91 in this video, but a woman in her 90s doing handstands on the parallel bars, doing planches, and very impressive gymnastics tricks that even like people in their 30s, most of them aren't able to do. So it just goes to show that if you maintain exercise throughout your life, then you can be very physically impressive, even in your 90s, and you also live longer because of that. Next up, VO2 max. So this is a marker used to assess your cardiorespiratory fitness, or how fit you are in terms of cardio performance. This is another marker that follows the similar trend line. It peaks when you're 18 years old and then starts to decline. So it even starts to decline much faster than muscle strength. And a low VO2 max is also linked to higher risk of mortality and heart disease. So people who have the lowest VO2 max have the highest risk of death from all causes. And people who have a higher VO2 max also live longer, and they have a reduced risk of mortality. And similar with grip strength, to have a higher VO2 max, you need to train for it. You're not really born with a very high VO2 max. You need to exercise for it. And it could also be that, yes, it's the exercise component that mediates the reduced risk of all-cause mortality, but it doesn't matter, like you still want to exercise. So if you exercise, your VO2 max will increase and you will become healthier as a result of that. In this study, they looked at the VO2 max of octogenarian athletes, so athletes who are 80 years old, and they found that their VO2 max was almost double than the untrained octogenarians, so the 80-year-olds who don't exercise. And the athletes, the 80-year-old athletes, their VO2 max was somewhere in the range of 39 milliliters per kilogram per minute, which is a good result for an 80-year-old. But the untrained octogenarians, their VO2 max was close to 17 and 18 milliliters per kilogram per minute. And if your VO2 max is below 17.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute, then that's considered below the frailty threshold. And below that threshold, you're not able to take care of yourself independently. So you require some assistance from a caretaker, etc. So you're not able to carry groceries, you're not able to put on clothes, you're not able to take care of yourself physically. So having a higher VO2 max increases your quality of life later in life as well, and it's linked to reduced risk of all chronic diseases. A good example, again, is from Orville Rogers, who was a 102-year-old runner, and he holds the world record in the 100-year-old age group for, I think, 80 meters and 400 meters running. And he was actually not a person who was exercising all throughout his life. He didn't exercise until the age of 50. His doctor discovered that he had heart disease in his 50s, but he still lived to 102 years of age. So this is a great example of a survivor. He got diagnosed with a chronic condition before the age of 80, and he still made it to 100 years of age. So he's actually one of the best inspirations to emulate, because he clearly doesn't have great genetics. He still got heart disease pretty early, but he out-exercised the heart disease essentially. He started running, not crazy amounts, but he maintained consistency for 50 years, which is why he was able to live so long as well. And exercise is pretty much the most powerful tool that we have for longevity right now. There's no supplement, there's no pill that is as powerful as exercise. Exercise improves the organ function of all the organs. Exercise reduces the risk factors of all chronic diseases. And exercise also improves all the hallmarks of aging that I mentioned earlier. Things like mitochondrial function, inflammation, cell senescence, genomic stability, etc. Exercise just improves all of them. And exercise is also a sign of biological youth. So if you have a higher VO2 max, you have higher grip strength, then you're with a more like a younger phenotype, essentially. You have a younger body, basically. So that's why I very often mention exercise, because it is the most powerful thing. There's no supplement that is as powerful as exercise. And it is also the easiest thing to do. It doesn't require a lot of financial investment. It requires only time, and the biggest hurdle is probably consistency and behavior. Visceral fat is another marker or a component of aging that increases with age linearly in both men and women. So when you're in your 20s, your visceral fat is quite low, but it increases with age. And a higher visceral fat is also a risk factor for heart disease and diabetes and earlier death, because we saw the picture of the intramuscular fat. So visceral fat is a type of that, and it also accumulates around the organs like the liver and the pancreas, where it hinders the organ function. Blood sugar levels also increase with age. So when you're younger, your blood sugar levels are lower. When you get older, the average blood sugar level typically increases. And to maintain a younger phenotype, to maintain a younger biological age, we want to have the blood sugar markers of someone who is, decades younger than us. The same with all of these other markers. We want to have the visceral fat of someone who is younger. Cholesterol levels also increase with age. We want to maintain lower cholesterol, because higher cholesterol, as we saw from the graph, typically is linked to a higher risk of heart disease. Sleep declines as well with age. So when we get older, we sleep shorter, and the sleep quality also declines. How much sleep are we talking about? It's recommended that 7 to 8 is the optimal amount, but the 7 hours is also actually linked to is kind of the sweet spot somewhere there. Next up, I'll cover some biomarkers. So we just mentioned glucose. So what is the optimal glucose range for the lowest risk of mortality? And it's somewhere between 80 to 94 milligrams per deciliter. And higher blood sugar level is linked to a higher risk of mortality and heart disease and diabetes. So we want to maintain a lower blood sugar level. Triglycerides, which are these fatty acid molecules, and with the glycerol in the bloodstream, this is also pretty linearly associated with a higher risk of heart disease. And we want to keep our triglycerides below 100, and ideally closer to 50 milligrams per deciliter. CRP, a marker of inflammation, linearly associated with mortality. We want to keep our inflammation as low as possible. Blood pressure, again, higher blood pressure is a risk factor for heart disease, and we want to keep our blood pressure normal and slightly lower. Cholesterol marker as well. What's the optimal cholesterol? In this study, they found that for younger individuals between the age of 18 to 45, it was below 150 milligrams per deciliter. And then for older groups, it was 180 milligrams per deciliter. So typically higher is worse. Body fat percentage. This is where there's some sex differences. For women, it doesn't really matter that much what's the body fat percentage. Anything between 20 to 35% body fat is there's no increased risk there. Whereas for men, a lower body fat percentage is better. So anything below 15% is better than above that. And above 30% is where the risk increases even more. Waist circumference. So your waist circumference, it can be a good way to assess your visceral fat. High waist circumference is a sign of visceral fat. And for both men and women, a lower waist circumference is linked to lower risk of mortality. For men, it's 85 centimeters, the lowest risk, and for women, 65 to 70 centimeters. Here's a list of some biomarkers to test regularly. Like you could measure hundreds of biomarkers. The more biomarkers you measure, the higher longevity intelligence is. But at some point, it becomes, too much. So if you just measure these markers, then you're getting 80% of the most valuable information from them. Lastly, I'll cover some genetic risk factors. The biggest genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's is apolipoprotein E. So if you have the ApoE4 allele, then that's the highest risk, and the lowest risk is E2. E3 is somewhere in the middle. So as you can see from the graph, if you have two E4 copies, that's the highest risk of Alzheimer's. And if you have two E2 alleles, that's the lowest risk of Alzheimer's. I'm personally E3, so I'm in the middle, which is where 61% of people are also at. If you have two E2 alleles, then that's the lowest risk. Only 0.5% of the population belongs here. And these people also have a lower risk of death overall. So this is like a protective gene. Now, you can't control your genes. You can only be aware of them. You can do like a DNA test to see, okay, I have these alleles, and I can be more careful with other risk factors. So I can be more careful with the other risk factors of Alzheimer's that I talked about before. Next up, we have lipoprotein A, or Lp(a), which is the biggest genetically determined heart disease risk factor. And lipoprotein(a) levels are linearly associated with a higher risk of heart disease. So the higher the Lp(a) levels are, the higher the risk. And you want to keep it, you can't control it that much with your diet and lifestyle. You can move it maybe 10 to 20%. But doing a blood test at least once in your life for the Lp(a), you can see, okay, where is my genetic predisposition for this marker? And again, be more careful with the other markers later. Cholesterol levels, that's also genetically determined. Some people have higher cholesterol levels, some people have lower cholesterol levels. People who have this severe hypercholesteremia, they typically also have a higher risk of heart disease. And people who have a lower genetically determined LDL levels, they also have a lower risk of heart disease because of that. So most people are obviously somewhere in the middle, and they can be just aware of the fact, okay, you can pay attention to your cholesterol levels. Here's a list of some more genetic risk factors. There's obviously thousands of genes out there, and we don't understand all of them. We understand only like a few key ones, such as ApoE4, Lp(a). There's also the methylation genes like MTHFR. That's also linked to high risk of heart disease. Familial hypercholesteremia, hemochromatosis, which is a higher iron levels that can increase the risk of liver disease and heart disease. And there's also like FTO genes that link to obesity. But to know that, you can do a DNA test. If you haven't done a DNA test, but you know that a lot of people in your family get a particular chronic disease, like everyone in your family gets heart disease or everyone in your family gets Alzheimer's, then that's also like a pretty big sign to pay attention to. So here are the components of longevity intelligence as I've outlined. You want to reduce the risk of these chronic diseases like heart disease and Alzheimer's and kidney disease. You want to know your genetic risks and adjust your lifestyle accordingly. You want to aim for the optimal blood markers like glucose and lipids. You want to maintain a younger biological age and fitness status, so like maintain the blood markers of someone who is a few decades younger, and maintain the fitness status and the body composition of someone who is a few decades younger. And lastly, you want to build your longevity reserve that includes physical, cognitive, and social reserve. And lastly, the question is, what's your longevity IQ? So it's obviously not a perfect metric. There's no biomarker to track for this, but it's just for yourself to, okay, where do I belong? Longevity IQ number 1 would be you have no idea what is healthy, you don't know anything about this, which is fine, you can learn from this conference. Number 2 is you understand your health superficially. You know, like, okay, obesity is bad, you know that you're not as fit or something like that, but it's kind of superficial. Level 3 is you've taken a blood test, you understand some of the basics, okay, too high blood sugar is bad, too high CRP is bad, and like, okay, I need to exercise. Number 4, you know your genetic risks and you know your risk factors for chronic diseases. So you know that some of your blood markers are not optimal and they're at a range that increases the risk of chronic diseases. And you're also aware of your genetic risks, like you have ApoE4 or whatnot. And last is your biological age. You do regular blood tests. You measure your fitness status with VO2 max and muscle mass, etc. You track your body composition, like your body fat percentage, and you track it regularly. So I don't think that you need to be at level 5. If you're at level 4, then that's already pretty good. Like level 5 is more, optimization. But at least level 4, I think, would cover all most important information for this. And thanks for listening. I've also recently published my new book, The Longevity Leap, that you can actually buy from the stand right there for a discount price for the conference. And if you have any questions, you can email me or check out my website. Thank you.
Or maybe, Siim, maybe we can have time for some questions here. Yes, we can have time for a couple of questions here. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so now you have the chance. Any questions? Yes, there. Jonathan is coming with the mic. He probably needs some help. Super, thank you very much.
Hi, thanks so much for the presentation. If you were to start a company working on longevity to try and extend the health span to 500 plus years, let's say, what would you work on for a start?
Yeah, like the problem is like we don't even know what to focus on if we're talking about extending a lifespan beyond like 120. Because, if you exercise, you take some supplements, you eat a good diet, then, that's not going to make you live to 200 years of age. Like, those things will, make you live to 100 maybe, and 110, they make you healthier for longer. But to live to 200 years and 300, etc., we need something that we don't know what it is. Maybe that's genetic engineering, maybe that's some pharmaceuticals, some rejuvenation technologies, but we don't know what it would be right now. So I guess I would start, obviously for health span and general population health, I would do something about making blood tests more easily accessible and cheaper for everyone, because tracking your blood markers is one of the most effective ways to prevent chronic diseases, because if you see that your blood markers are getting worse over time, then you can course correct faster. Whereas if you never take a blood test for 10 years and then you suddenly go to the doctor and they say you have diabetes, it didn't happen overnight. It happened somewhere over the course of 10 years. So you need to be tracking things regularly to know what's your risk, and I think that is what is missing the most right now.
Super, thank you. And one more question. Who's the lucky one? Down and back. I'm sorry, Jonathan, that you have to run all the way, but... Oh, it's a tricky one. Super.
Hi, thank you so much. Great presentation. I also liked your longevity IQ score. And from lots of people I know, most of them are the score 3 or 4 at least. But what I observed that not many people actually take their knowledge to the action. Mm. What is your take on it, and what would make people to act more proactively and really take matters in their hands? Thank you.
Yeah, so it's hard to make people do things that they don't want to do. So, they might be aware of their blood markers, but if they don't, do something about it, they don't make changes to their lifestyle, then it's something that needs to be figured out. Maybe there's some procrastination, something that's self-sabotage or something like that. It's hard to say what is the reason why they don't make the changes, and it varies a lot between people. I think making it just easier for people to do things, like making it more accessible to go to the gym and making it accessible to take the blood test, and making some sort of a community as well is important, because if everyone around you wants to be healthier, then you're more likely to do it as well. And if you live in a society or an environment that supports unhealthier lifestyles, then you're more likely to resort to it. So it requires some cultural change, and at the end of the day, everyone is responsible for their own health. And I think at least when you are aware of these things, you can decide, okay, do I really want to spend 5 hours a day doing this, or am I fine doing it only 1 to 2 hours? And maybe get slightly worse results. So it's for everyone to kind of decide how much they actually want to invest into this, time investment.
Super. Thank you, Siim, for joining Copenhagen Health Week. Let's give him a hand.